Good morning. My name is Sandra and I'm here to share with you my February Fabric Funhouse Junk Journal Challenge resource binders that I made for Dearjuliejulie February 2022 challenge. So I've decided to make a quilting resource binder. My inspiration came from this book and this quilt that was designed by Jan Bowman. This book, The Better House and Gardens, is a 1977 version. So the digital I used from Dearjuliejulie is Spring Flowers, and the material, most of the material I'm using is from a couple of bags of fabric a friend of mine gave me, and when I dumped out the one bag of fabric, 72 quilting squares fell out of the bag. They're vintage. Some of them were sewn together, some of them weren't. The threads were very fragile and you could easily take it apart. And I thought, well, I'm not going to sew it all back together and fix it and make it into a quilt, so I'll find something else to do with it. So the quilt, my inspiration quilt, is called What is a Quilt? And the book that I'm using there, the binder I'm using, is an old photo album that I found at a thrift store. It had the black pages with the plastic on it that you could stick your photos to. It was never used, this binder, so I had all these cardboards that were available to me. I only used 15 and I have another 20 in the basement. So the first thing, what is the quilt? Well, the quilt is color. So my thought to that was the color wheel. And I use a color wheel quite often in my designs, so I added a color wheel to a great big mega tag. I decorated it with the rainbow cotton, added some rickrack. The other inspiration I used was a show guide of quilts from 2004, and I would put one of the quilts in the show on journaling cards, and I can use that for inspiration if I want to write down some ideas that that quilt might have inspired me. A quilt is love, so I had some of these pink wool hearts in my stash, so I added those to that. This is a quilt that I made, some leftover flowers that I made. This is called Grandma's Garden. It's made out of English paper piecing. I didn't use for the quilt, but I put it in here. I left the paper in the hexes to make it a more stable mega belly band. In the belly band I have put a file folder pocket. I've put one of Dearjuliejulie's cards in there. It says Grandma's Garden, English paper piecing. And I've decorated it with a cluster of other images. For soft, I made myself a little pin holder or a needle holder for this corner. And on this page is a large fabric flip, and it's a layered fabric flip. Little crocheted flower there, some stenciling or some stamping I did on a piece of fabric, and there is a pocket with a tag, and underneath the quilt batting. This is hemp quilt batting that I use for my winter quilt, my Christmas quilt rather. And another one of the journaling cards with an inspiration quilt on the front of it, with some stamping that I use the fancy tool with that does stamping on rolling stamping. Patchwork. I had a beautiful piece of fabric that had a garden with cottages, and I just put some of the patchwork on the front here, and I made a patchwork pocket, which is also a tip-in, and Julie's digital there, all about embroidery lessons, and my card, and I made a little cluster with a yo-yo to hold the pocket down. And because this is a resource binder, I decided I would put my resources in it before I showed you. So throughout the binder you'll see some of that. Applique. I used my Derwent Ink Intense pencil crayons, or watercolor pencil crayons, and I drew some flowers, and then I appliqued around them onto this patch. This pocket is a 7 pocket. It has the big pocket in the inside. It has a pocket here for holds 2 envelopes. The fabric pocket that I did some stenciling on. This is a Julie Fan Balzer design of a doily. That's the stencil. In there I've put 2 greeting cards. If I ever give a quilt away, I can give them a card. And there's a pocket on the front as of one of them, and it has 2 little pockets on it. So 2 greeting cards with 2 envelopes, the big pocket, and then the small pocket has 2. Quilt is warm, of course I think of wool, so there is a wool applique flower. And wool is felt, and so I made a waterfall felt needle book. So some pins and needles. This is printed transfer. It's heat transferred onto fabric. And I made a pocket out of another one of those with this applique scissor onto a piece of Julie's music sheet. And there's another one of the wool hearts, applique wool hearts. And gentle hands. Gentle hands, I think of Amish quilts, and so I took the beautiful inspiration, the other part of my inspiration material, added that to a whole page, made it the second layer so I could tuck in a very large tag with a pocket with some stamping on it and a little collage here. How do you set up my sewing feet for quilting? Some other information that I've collected when I went to classrooms. How to set my machine to the right stitch to get the perfect 1/4 inch. And some other basic quilting ideas. I have this quilt pattern with pieces that I just put in that envelope. And in here is another little book I made, and this is my patchwork cover. I didn't classify this as my cover because these were already made, but so I did put some of the other fabrics that I've been using. And this is a resource book to tuck in here that is your project, date started, date completed, the reason you made the project, your materials, inspiration for the project. So I have quite a few of those pages left. They have a grid on the back to use for design. Inspiration, I used just some blank papers, and then the references. These pages are trimming, notions, flea markets, craft stores, sewing machine repairs, quilting websites, sort of like that. So that's a book that I never used before for actually sewing, but I had it in my stash. So the pages that I had just scribbled on, I took away and rebound this into a new binding as I sewed it. So that is volume 1. Because the pages became so big, I had to go into a second volume. So my second volume is the same concept. It's a binder that I had in my stash that was falling apart, duct taped it together, and made a cover from the quilt squares. I made this to cover that blue, and our first inspiration page for that one was crazy quilts. So I made a piece of the crazy quilt, used some embroidery on it, and on this side I used, oh my goodness, another piece of the crazy quilt that I made. I put some lace on it, the dollar store lace. I added a very large tag in there, and in the back it has a pocket with more of the crazy quilt with a piece of embroidery I did and some crocheted flowers. You'll see the crocheted flowers throughout the binder. I made about, I don't know, 10 yo-yos with buttons. On this one I appliqued around it, did some more stitching, and added some ribbon for the leaves. This is some resource that I have. A quilt is fluffy, and for fluffy, of course, I think of the quilt batting. And on this one, I made a corner tuck out of a piece of quilt, just, you know, the pre-made quilt squares. I bound it with the seam binding and or quilt binding, and I put these inspiration from the book quilt. I did a book here. It's a file folder that I covered with fabric, and I did some stamping on there. Another yo-yo, a Dearjuliejulie digital in here, and another yo-yo, and I just put paper. I just sewed paper into this little book. Again, you could use it for almost anything. And on the side where the tab was for the file folder, I put some measuring tape. Another quilt pattern, and the quilt is cozy. And when I think of cozy, garden, cottage, scrappy quilts, and so I have this. It was another heat transfer that I transferred onto fabric. It is a 3-pocket piece. I have a couple of tucks in there. One is just a small little book out of a Dearjuliejulie digital, and a scrappy cluster. And a good night. A good night, I think of babies, kids, quilts. So I made an envelope out of a piece of fabric and quilted it. In here I just have a little journal piece of paper. I threw on the failed printing or painting images. I don't know if you've seen it that I posted, but it had a pretty bad fail. Then I did in my second attempt by just adding more acrylics over top of it. It turned out okay, but it's, you know, that's how you learn, is by trying. And most of all the lettering and all the other images that were small, I used my die cutting machine to cut out the fabric, and use Wonder underneath it so I could iron it on. And for patterns, in my sewing room right now, I'm making a quilt that has this fabric in it, so I made a pinwheel with some scraps that were on my desk, and that is there. And on here I've printed again these log cabin variations, 4 different variations, and I printed them on paper, transfer paper, and then transferred them to the fabric, and so these are little fabric pockets, and I sewed them on my fabric before I glued it to the photo album page. So I have 3 of the cards in here, my Cancer quilt or show guide ones, quilts inspirations, and then I made a little journaling card with Julie's digital as well, with a crocheted flower and a scrap. And modern I don't do a lot of, but there's this is a batik fabric that I sewed around and added some beads to. And on this side I printed a beautiful image from a magazine that inspired me, and hopefully one day I will do some more modern quilt stuff. There's a yo-yo there. I made a ruffle border and some fabric beads. I don't know if you can see the fabric beads, but I made 3 of them, and I just hung them on that border. And the border also makes a little tuck spot. And there's my resource for water and machine quilting. And a textile sandwich. So I made a layered cluster to go there, and on this side is my stained glass quilting, and I made that I made a big quilt, you'll see it in a bit, for a wall hanging, but when I was finished it, I thought this was fun. I have some scraps left over, so I just printed an image from the internet and turned that into a quilt panel. I had it in a frame, but it really didn't have a home, so I used it for a very large fabric flip. And I have a pocket that I've put some ribbon on. I have a very large tag, and it has 3 pockets in it, and in the tag just has 3 tags in the pockets. And again, a Dearjuliejulie image on the front of that. And I used an antique ribbon tie to tie my quilt to the page. In this one folder here, it's full of the patterns for this quilt, and this is the quilt that I made into my wall hanging. It hangs in our bedroom, and so I wanted to keep those patterns, but I don't think I'm ever going to make another one, but they're there. A quilt is old, and when I think basically we're at the end of making your quilt now, you tell your story, you sign your name, and you date it. And so this page is my page that represents that. So this poem was found in the back of a 1890 quilt. Here it says, by Sandra Chenko, inspired by Dearjuliejulie, February Fabric Junk Journal Challenge 2022. I have my journaling card, and I have a needle book that is old that I put together. It was falling apart, so I just fixed it up a little bit to go in there. And I'm going to read you the poem. Embroidery designs that make the quilt gay are pleasures and duties we find on our way. Hope, love, and kisses are stitched so bright, which decorate life with gleams of delight. While sympathy sweet is the lining to hold the odd scraps of fate which we cannot control. We are better than patchwork because of the soul. And that gets tucked in here. Another little yo-yo. Some more resources at the end of volume 2. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed making it. I thank Julie again for her inspiration. This is not what I had planned at the beginning, but my mind goes that way once I start thinking of something and what do I have to work with and what can I make out of it. This is what I turned it into. And it's something that I will have and treasure and use for a long time to come. Well, enjoy the rest of February, and looking forward to March to see what our challenge will be. Thank you. Bye-bye.